And welcome back to another episode. In this video, we are going to continue to read deeply into Scott Adams' book, Win Bigly, by looking at what he calls the persuasion filter. Now, in our previous video, you should have learned that human brains have not evolved to understand reality. Now, the reason for this is in fact that understanding reality on a deep level is not necessary from an evolutionary perspective. The only thing evolution cares about is whether you, as a species, procreate. So whether a mouse or an elephant or an amoeba has an accurate view of reality is completely irrelevant. The only important thing is do they procreate? So whether from looking at from a human perspective, whether a human being believes in God or is an atheist or is a vegan, none of this matters. The only thing that matters is, evolutionary wise, is do you reproduce? So what Scott came up with was his idea of filters, and that to one extent or another, whether we're aware of it or not, we all try and go through life interpreting these signals that we get by using filters. So a filter, as a definition, is a way in which we frame our observations in an attempt to comprehend reality, despite the fact that you are incapable of truly understanding reality. And to Scott, you judge a filter's value by two criteria. One, does it make you happy? And two, does it help you predict the future? Because if it does help you predict the future, you can better control your own reality and the reality you're going to experience later on. And from there, Scott kind of goes through his own life and explores some of the filters that he has used. And this will kind of further expand on the concept of filters and hopefully allow you to understand it a bit better. Now, the first filter that Scott ever used that he is aware of is what he calls the Santa Claus filter. And what this filter basically says is that there are these kind of magical beings like Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny or the Tooth Fairy, and they come and give you things. So the good thing about the Santa Claus filter is that it did in fact make him happy. And I think the Santa Claus filter makes all of us happy when we're kids. And the other bonus for the Santa Claus filter is that it did help him predict the future. Santa Claus comes at a regular time, the Easter Bunny comes at a regular time, and so does the Tooth Fairy. So as a filter, it actually works quite well. Now obviously, as you grow older, you realize that Santa Claus is not real, and we all lose this filter. Our mistake, though, is thinking that any of the future filters that we get are any better than the Santa Claus filter. And in fact, most of them aren't. Now, the next filter that Scott used is called the church filter. And he liked the idea of perhaps going to heaven one day. So the idea of going to heaven made him happy. But as far as predicting the future, the church filter didn't really work at all. He found that prayers didn't really work for him, and people couldn't predict when the next miracle would happen or when saints would appear. So for predicting the future, the church filter wasn't that great. And what ultimately broke the church filter for Scott was the story of Jonah and the whale. And in that story, Jonah is drowning and he prays to God, and then a whale comes along, swallows him whole, and Jonah lives in this whale's stomach for 3 days. At that point, Jonah is constantly praying, and then God says to the whale to release Jonah, and Jonah is fine. As a young boy, Scott, for whatever reason, this is a story that kind of broke the camel's back as far as church goes for Scott, in that he thought there's no way Jonah could live in a whale for 3 days, that the stomach acid would obviously tear him apart, not only that, there wouldn't be air to breathe. And of course, he's taking Jonah and the whale very literally, not from a mythical point of view, but that would be a different filter. But so what Scott did then is he went to his mom and explained this to her, and said he didn't want to go to church anymore. And his mom, to her credit, said, okay, that's okay. But so at this point, the church filter was gone for Scott. The next filter he put on was what he called the alien filter. Now, after he had kind of abandoned religion, he's still living in a very religious town, and he's got to figure out why is he so different. So his brain came up with the idea that he was in fact somehow an alien experiment, and aliens were watching him. This helped him explain why he was different than everybody else who were regular church-going folk, but it didn't make him happy, nor did it have any kind of predictive powers. So the alien filter wasn't very helpful, and once again he dropped it. The next filter he came across that he put on was what he would call the atheist filter. So he became an atheist, and he liked the idea that there's no supreme being, that humans are rational and can understand things through observation, science, and reason. That is quite appealing. However, he couldn't say that one thing also he enjoyed as a combative young man was he enjoyed arguing about atheism with anybody that he would encounter. And at that age, I think that makes kind of sense. When you're a little kid, you kind of think, oh, adults know everything. And then at some point, you figure out that they don't know anything. Sometimes they know a lot less than you. And that tends to be when kids or teenagers are in the rebellious phase and questioning everything. So you kind of understand, I think, why atheism had a real appeal for Scott at this point. Nonetheless, the atheist filter to him provided him with no predictive powers and didn't really make him happy. So he also moved on from his atheist filter. Next filter he used was the weed filter. Right now he's in university of some sort, and smoking weed did make him happy. It also did provide him with some predictive powers, and that when he was smoking weed, to him, it seemed that people would be nicer to him. And then he started to question, why was this? And he kind of came up with two reasons. One, it's either purely from his perception, because the marijuana is making him calmer and more relaxed, and therefore he's perceiving people as being nicer to him. Or, on the other hand, perhaps people actually are being nicer to him because he is so relaxed. So, was it his perception, or because he was nicer and people were being nicer to him? What's the reality? Once again, you should know by now that it actually doesn't matter. The only key thing is, does it make him happy, and does the weed filter allow for a certain amount of predictions about the future? Well, it actually does, and this may be the best filter since the Santa Claus filter. However, it's still limited somewhat, so Scott moved on from the weed filter. Next, he came across the mushroom filter, and at one point I think one of his roommates had him try some psychedelic mushrooms, and he has to admit this was one of the most joyous experiences ever. Now, I've never taken psychedelic mushrooms, but Scott tries to explain what the feeling is like. And apparently when you try magic mushrooms, you have this feeling that you understand the world around you. And you come to realize how much your interpretation of reality is fluid. It's almost like you're seeing ordinary items for the very first time. You almost feel like you're an alien experiencing everything, and yet you understand them. But what becomes very clear to him, or what became very clear to Scott, was that you are aware that your perceptions of reality are independent from the underlying reality. And this is what really made a lasting impression on him. And the bottom line is that your experience of life is an interpretation of reality. And you can change how you interpret that reality at any time. And what Scott would say is to put on a filter that makes you happy and that allows you to predict the future. And that's how you should experience reality. Nonetheless, this is not saying you should go out and try psychedelic drugs or mushrooms. Scott does stress to don't do drugs, and but in fact, that the mind-altering experience that he had taking the mushrooms, you will get as well just by reading this book, and you will experience the same perceptual shift that he did. His most current and best filter that he uses as an adult is what he calls the moist robot filter. And in this filter, he sees humans as being like moist computers that can be reprogrammed. And the persuasion filter is actually a subset of the moist robot filter. And the persuasion filter states that human beings are moist robots who are easily influenced by emotional and other irrational factors. Most people, if you were to ask them, probably believe that they are rational 90% of the time, and maybe irrational 10% of the time. But if you're a trained hypnotist, like Scott is, you quickly learn that the reality is basically the opposite. We are irrational 90% of the time, and rational 10% of the time, and we're only rational when dealing with minor things like paying bills or filling up your car with gas. And the other thing hypnotists learn is that we are constantly making irrational decisions, and we justify them as being rational later. Now, the reaction to Trump's inaugural speech was kind of the best example of how irrational we are, and how important the filters are that you wear. So if you had a pro-Trump filter on and you heard Trump's speech, you probably saw it as being inclusive and optimistic. But if you had the anti-Trump filter on, as most in the media did, who also, by the way, totally incorrectly called the election, you would see it as being dark and divisive. And a lot of people, what some people did was they took Trump's speech, took it to some of their anti-Trump friends and said this was an Obama speech. What do you think of it? And at that point they put on their pro-Obama filters and they thought it was a wonderful speech. And as soon as they were told that it was actually what Trump said, that's when some cognitive dissonance set in, which we'll get into later. Now, at this point, you may accept the idea of filters or see that it might be a useful tool, but you might be wondering, just how can people be so delusional? And in order to understand that, we need to go into the topics of cognitive dissonance and confirmation bias. And that's what we'll be going to be looking into in the next video. Now, in the meantime, though, what do you think? Do you have any questions about the concept of filters? Have you used filters in yourself that are a little bit different? I'd be very interested in hearing from them if you want to leave any comments in the comment section. But what filters have you used in your life? And as well, if this is all interesting to you, although I'm reading the whole book, you'll likely enjoy reading Scott's book for yourself as well, and there is a link below to that in the description. And it is an affiliate link, so it will help the channel if you're so inclined. And other than that, that's it for now. So thank you for watching, and until next time.